time to return to the deathless forces of the Tomb Worlds, because today we're talking 30 tips for playing Necrons in Warhammer 40k. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, the strategy-focused 40k channel, where today we're talking Necrons, and as we've done similarly with Imperial Guard and Space Marines, I thought we'd go through 30 rapid-fire tips for playing the faction in the current game. Most of these are just based on my opinions as to how to play Necrons the strongest, and it's not meant to be any sort of exhaustive list or anything, so if you have any other insights, please let me know down in the comments, or if you disagree with any of the thoughts. In any case, I'm going to be moving quite quickly, jumping around all over the Codex. Hopefully there should be a little bit of inspiration for new and returning players alike. With all that being said, let's jump into it and get started. So currently in 9th edition, I'd argue that Necrons are perhaps an upper mid-tier army, a fairly solid faction with some decent options and datasheets, but maybe suffering a little bit from early Codex syndrome. Certainly pretty great compared with most 8th edition codexes, but maybe not holding its own compared with some of the more recent 9th edition releases, armies like Admech, Death Guard, Drukhari and Sisters. They're still very much capable of placing solidly at many tournaments though, and people are still having good success with them. Necron warriors are a solid troops unit, really quite hardy and annoying to shift with their reanimation protocols where they get back up on 5s. Out of the gun choices, I'd usually prefer to take the Gauss Reaper over the Gauss Flayer. I think that the close range punch with the strength 5 and extra AP makes up for the short range, and usually that'll be how I'd choose to field them. They can either foot slog into battle in either 20 or 10 strong blobs. The 20 strong units can be really quite efficient for receiving things like buffs such as invul saves from Chronomancers or My Will Be Done, or maybe teleporting around with the Veil of Darkness. Maybe going to smaller units is a bit more efficient if you're not going to invest too much in buffing the units, and you could certainly consider running them up the board in Ghost Arcs for a bit of protection, healing models and some close range fire support. Immortals are also quite a solid troops choice, maybe best to consider if you're running them in small 5-man units. For the stronger Necron dynasties, my two favourites are either Novok for a more melee focused Necron list, bonuses to charges and AP once you get there are both nice, and I really quite like the custom dynasties as well, the ones that give you OBSEC on all units, which is really powerful on the 9th missions, and particularly backed up by that custom dynasty that gives you a 6-inch pre-game move to allow you to position your forces better and react to your opponents. You could potentially swap out the pre-game move for one of the other benefits though I think that is one of the best. I'd say that those ones are the ones that tend to get played the most in competitive armies. Other interesting ones could be Mefrit for a bit of a ranged boost to various low AP weapons, and perhaps Zotek not really so much for the dynastic code, but because it allows you access to a fair few interesting characters. My first choice would be one of the top two though. If you're looking to blow up some tanks at range, the Necrons do have a fair few options to choose from, and I feel like the most efficient currently are the Doomsday Ark and Locust Heavy Destroyers. The Doomsday Ark and the Doomstalker do have quite a lot of similarities, they both need to stay stationary to shoot, and I actually did a comparison video a fair few months back trying to rank which one was better. In that video I concluded that they were fairly equal in terms of value for what you got, but since then the Doomsday Ark has dropped down 20 points, so that puts it ahead for me. I think now it's solidly ahead both in terms of durability and damage output, particularly as it can flex into being really quite a nasty anti-infantry vehicle with all those Gauss flares if the enemy gets too close. Otherwise the Locust Heavy Destroyers are quite nice with their big 3d3 damage gun. Again, they went down in points fairly recently in the chapter approved. And otherwise I do think that the Doomscythe and Doomstalker are potentially useful, just maybe not quite on the same level. One interesting stratagem that you can use with a Nightscythe or Monolith is Prismatic Dimensional Breach, and it can be one of the most reliable ways to get a charge out of Deep Strike with a reserved unit. It is a little bit command point heavy, as you do need to put the unit into strategic reserve, and then you need to spend one further command points to use this stratagem, but then all you have to do is move your Nightscythe to really close to an enemy unit, get your unit out just out of engagement range, and you'll essentially get an automatic charge with a unit of Lich Guard or Flayed Ones or something that very few other armies have the power to do. I guess the main weakness is having to buy in the Nightscythe, which is kind of okay for damage output but nothing spectacular, and I guess it might get shot down before you get to use it, but even then you can still come out of strategic reserve normally and just have a less reliable charge. There's a fair few upgrades that you can take for Cryptek Arcana, the paid for in points upgrades that you can give to your various Crypteks. I think that as a table it's kind of okay, though not absolutely essential to include, and these four are perhaps some of my favourites. The Hypermaterial Ablator is a 25-point upgrade to grant light cover. I think that's really quite reliable. Not bad to throw on a big unit of Immortals or Warriors as you move up with a Chronomancer maybe. The failsafe Overcharger can be good if you're trying to use Cryptek units as damage dealers. +1 attack per model is no bad thing at all. Can be nice on things like Wraiths or Spiders or Scarabs. Quite nice in combination with a Technomancer with a Cryptek control node. Otherwise, the Photonic Transubjector, that one makes your Cryptek less likely to die as the first failed save goes to damage 0. And finally, the Cantemporal Nanomines can be used to slow down an enemy unit, a 30-point upgrade to half your advance and charge moves. The main disadvantage for that one is to having to get somewhat close with a fairly fragile Cryptek. Lichguard I think are one of the strongest Necron units right now, a really solid squad to have in your battle line, and often see play in competitive lists. I would personally take the Sword and Shield loadout myself. A big squad will put out enough meaningful damage to make their presence felt, and the shields just make them so much more hardy and difficult to shift. For me, they're perhaps one of the biggest and most threatening Necron core units that you can build around. Quite a good target for any stratagems that amp up damage or durability, or buffs like My Will Be Done, Resurrection Orbs, or various other things. I think they're rarely going to be a wrong choice in the battle line, slogging towards a midfield objective. In my opinion, probably the strongest Necron relic is the Veil of Darkness. That's the one that allows you to teleport a character and a Necron unit around the board, and really helps get around Necrons being at least somewhat slow in game. I'd say maybe one of the most obvious combos with it is maybe taking a Chronomancer and Necron Warriors. The Chronomancer can buff the Necron Warriors, teleport them up the board, and unleash a lot of close-range Gauss fire. We'll look at that combo again in a little bit, but it can also be used for lots of other things, such as just getting things up towards objectives, potentially positioning melee units for a charge out of Deep Strike, or even rescuing shooting units from being locked up in melee so they can teleport away and still shoot, as they technically haven't fallen back. I think it's quite rare to see a Necron list that doesn't include this. Here are a couple of the Warlord traits I like best. I think Eternal Madness is a hard one to go too far wrong with on an Overlord. It allows you to reroll wound rolls, so it's pretty nice paired with a War Scythe or Void Scythe. Otherwise, Implacable Conqueror can be a good one to boost melee units into combat. And for the dynastic specific ones, I quite like the Zarakan one to double up on a useful command protocol, or the Sotek one for a 5+ command point refund. The Zarakan one is often quite relevant, as it's the one that the Silent King gets, and he's a relatively common choice to lead competitive Necron lists. For assembling a Necron collection in the real world, I did make an entire video about this, but I think it's worth reiterating whenever possible that if you're looking to buy a squad of Necron warriors, I wouldn't just buy the set that's available from Games Workshop on sale. I would generally buy the Recruit Starter set for 9th edition. It's just an extra $5 or £3.50, and for that you do get a pretty impressive amount of models. You get a Royal Warden that you could always use as a fancy looking Immortal if you fancied it, plus the Lieutenant and 5 other Space Marines that you could either keep for yourself, trade, or sell. I personally never buy a regular Necron Warrior kit. I'd either buy this set, or perhaps consider picking up some Necron Warriors from eBay, where they'll likely be going a bit cheaper just due to the Recruit set existing. As I mentioned, Novok is one of my favourite dynasties, and I think one of the most competitive. It gives you a +1 to charge, a bonus AP when you charge, and a nice stratagem for +1 attack on any Necron unit in melee. It also lets you double up on both benefits of the Protocol of the Hungry Void, which I think is one of the stronger command protocols. The Blood Scythe is also fairly reasonable in melee for a fighty Overlord. I would say it's maybe fairly comparable with the Void Scythe though. In particular, I think that Novok tends to synergize well with any Necron units that are really quite low AP in combat, which there are quite a few of. Scarab Swarms will really like it, so will Flayed ones, and even the lowly Necron Warriors can actually turn into a reasonable melee threat, with the extra AP on the charge at AP -1, and then use the stratagem for potentially an extra 20 melee attacks, which could easily have them chewing through hordes in combat. Anything else melee will really like Novok though, things like Lichguard, Cryptek Destroyers, or all the other combat choices. Secondaries wise, Necrons have 4 choices. I'd say that these 3 are probably the strongest. Perhaps Purge the Vermin might be one of the most tempting picks. If the enemy doesn't have all that many units, or you're fairly happy that you're going to be able to delete some of the outlying ones, it should be fairly easy to rid at least 1/4 of the board from enemy presence per turn, and if you can do that for more than one, then you're fairly likely to get a solid amount of victory points from that. Code of Combat I'd say is still quite good, though a little bit niche. You get victory points for killing units with noble units. I'd say it's maybe one to consider if you're taking the Silent King and the enemy's got quite a lot of small units. Probably not worth bothering with though if you've only got things like Catacomb Command Barges running around. And finally, Ancient Machineries does seem like a fairly easy one to rustle up a few victory points for. Your opponent picks 2 objectives and you pick 1, you get 3 victory points per action that you complete on one of those objectives. So it does mean that you could potentially sit on your home field objective and farm up a few victory points over the course of the game. Might compete a bit with things like Raised Banners though. The Hexmark Destroyer perhaps isn't one of the strongest Necron units, I'd say. Its damage output really isn't all that great, even when it's firing against its absolute optimal target of Horde infantry, but sometimes I think its utility can just about put it over the edge. If you need command protocols on a deep striking unit, say maybe flayed ones, then he is a cheap character that will at least do some reliable damage output and provide that buff, and he can also bear relics and warlord traits if you need him to. If you're just looking to make his damage a bit more efficient, then the Gauntlets of the Conflagrator maybe could be a worse choice. That's the one where you might deal a mortal wound to every model in the unit on the roll of a 6, so it really helps him double down on killing hordes. When using reanimation protocols, I'd make sure to try and gain as much movement or repositioning as you can while doing so. The models are restored to the squad wherever you want to place them. The only restrictions is that they can't be placed closer to the enemy in the charge phase, and they can't be put into engagement range if your unit isn't already within engagement range of a unit. There's quite a lot you can do with gaining a bit of random movement in your opponent's turn. Either get closer to the enemy if you're being shot to death with one of your melee units. You could place models out of line of sight to hopefully make the squad survive if the rest of the other models are killed. You might be able to chain out and snag an objective that your opponent wasn't expecting to, or you could just put some Necron warriors in the way of your opponent's units and maybe block their movement if they're trying to charge one of your key targets. Just usually I think there will be something that you can do to gain an advantage other than just simply setting up the models at the back of your squad. For the troop slot, warriors and immortals do compete for the role, and if you math out the numbers including the boosted reanimation protocols for warriors, durability does tend to be almost identical between the two units. Sure, immortals have better toughness and better saves, but they also cost more points. Overall, for the points, maybe the only big difference is that mortals are a little bit tougher against strength 4 weapons, so are quite good at weathering things like bolt fire, and have a little bit more benefit from getting light cover as they already have quite high saves to begin with. Warriors will be more resistant to mortal wounds though, just because they put more wounds on the table for the same points. In general, I think that both of them are pretty viable. With warriors you can think about taking really big squads to put maximal buffs on them, they have good synergy with Ghost Arcs, and they do better damage up close when they are armed with Gauss Reapers for the points. Immortals hand out some better long range damage, and they have smaller units for filling detachments and objective camping. I think it is quite helpful to be honest that both troops are usable, and one doesn't completely eclipse the other. I must admit I think that command protocols are a little bit of a weak buff compared with what a lot of other armies get as an entire army buff. They're certainly a nice to have, but I think you can still afford to pass them up in favour of taking multiple dynasties if it makes more sense for your army list. I think perhaps my main issues with them is that they're not all that flexible, and the buffs that you actually get from them tend to be fairly weak. Maybe some of the best uses in my opinion are getting light cover turn 1 if you happen to go second and your units haven't moved, or you could go for plus 1 inch movement turn 1, that could be quite a reliable little movement buff, and then generally after that I'd try and time the protocol of the Hungry Void for when your units are likely to be hitting melee if they're going to. That's particularly relevant for Novok, and I think it's particularly good if you're playing Novok with also the Silent King present, as he could allow you 2 turns with the boosted Novok Hungry Void. Other than that though, the rest are kind of okay, though not enormously standout, and they can be kind of annoying to deliver as well, as it means that you have to keep your units cooched up to characters at all times, even when they might not want to be. For HQ choices to lead the Dusty Legions into battle, my favourites at the moment are probably the Overlord, Chronomancer and Technomancer. I think they all give you some very reliable boosts for your points, though plenty of the other options are very usable as well depending on the list. Overlords are relatively fighty, give my will be done, and allow you to get your command protocols, and you can think about upgrading to the Catacomb command barge as well, which certainly makes them a lot more of a threat and a lot tougher, but are quite pricey after they went up in the chapter approved book. Chronomancers give you really quite good value for the points, as we'll get onto in a second, and Technomancers could be nice to help set up a few injured or dead warriors, or maybe lead Canoptek units or vehicles into battle. Otherwise, I think that Illuminor Seraz is fairly sturdy and brings some interesting buffs. The Scorpek Lord's a bit of a melee powerhouse, though you do pay a few more points for him. The Royal Warden can be good for big blocks of warriors and things to allow them to fall back and shoot if they need to, and the Standard Lord can be good in conjunction with an Overlord if you are looking for maximum rerolls and overlapping buffs. Speaking of solid HQs, the Chronomancer I think is perhaps one of my favourites, really solid value for 80 to 90 points, and grants his 5+ invul and reroll charges to 1 unit per turn. It's pretty much ideal with warriors and scarabs, whose low saves will really make nice use of the invul, and they're both fairly hardy units even before that happens, so will make them very annoying to shift for the points indeed. On top of that, he has his very nice Entropic Lance shot for a big damage D3+3 if it goes through, and I think he's really good to pair with the Veil of Darkness and maybe that Hyper Material Ablator to also give the squad he's buffing light cover. If you're running Catan, I think I'd typically choose the ones that have 24-inch range as my first selections. I think Antimatter Meteor, Sky of Falling Stars, and Transdimensional Thunderbolt all have their uses, and which one's best is generally going to depend on your opponent's army. Opportunistically, I might be tempted to swap out for Cosmic Fire if you have an absolute ton of enemy units nearby, as you might be able to blitz the enemy with some mass mortal wounds if you can get him within 9 inches of a whole bunch of units at once. Could be worth the stratagem. I'd largely say that most of the Necron Codex is fairly well balanced. Almost every unit does seem to have at least some situations where you'd want to take them. Though I'd say for the points cost, I'd say that the Obelisk and maybe the Cryptek Reanimator are some of the ones that are slight letdowns. The Obelisk uses a Lord of War slot and is relatively tough, though it just really doesn't do all that much in terms of damage. It just runs the risk of being a fairly durable unit that your opponent can kind of afford to ignore. I'd take a Monolith or a Tesseract Vault instead. The other one that I'm not really the biggest fan of is the Cryptek Reanimator. Its buff is kind of good on a big block of warriors, but its main problem is that it's just really quite easy to kill for the points. I'd only really want to use it if I could guarantee that I could hide it out of line of sight. Maybe you could just about justify it if it's lurking in a ruin at the back of the board and you've got some warriors chaining back to it so it could see them to apply its buff. I'd say that might be one of the best ways to get the value out of a relatively underwhelming unit. Scarab Swarms again I think are one of the stronger Necron units, and are one of the cheapest units in terms of points that you pay for wounds on the board in all of 40k. It means that whether your opponent's shooting at them with anti-tank weapons or light infantry fire, they're generally going to be fairly sturdy to remove. They can gum up the board with the pre-game move and Auspex Dynasty, and they've got a couple of handy stratagems, including one to self-destruct for some mortal wounds, and a heroic intervention stratagem that can really help them defend objectives. I'd say a few good units are rarely going to be a bad choice, though maybe with the way that the Secondaries have been rewritten, it might not be the ideal unit to spam multiple max-size units of. It might put you at some risk of the enemy taking the objective, where you score a point for every 10 wounds removed from the table, and max squads of Scarabs are quite an easy way to do that. Other than the excellent Veil of Darkness that we've already talked about, these are another few of the more generic relics that I quite like. I think the Orb of Eternity is really quite a good idea if you're getting a Resurrection Orb anyway. It could easily be worth an extra 2 or 3 extra warriors on a big Reanimation Protocols roll. Standing them back up on a 4+ re-rolling wand is very nice indeed. The Voltaic Staff can add some serious shooting punch to an Overlord with a Staff of Light. Strength 6, Damage 2 and Exploding 6s is going to put some hurt on any enemy infantry and can even menace some light vehicles. And the Void Reaper is quite a nice melee boost, and maybe pairs quite nicely with the re-rolling Wound Rolls Warlord Trait. It's Strength 7 and Damage 3, you don't have any -1 to hit, it ignores Feel No Pain type saves, and it's 10 points cheaper less than upgrading to a Void Scythe, as you can just use it to upgrade a regular War Scythe too. The Silent King is a pretty reasonable big mid-board threat for a Necron army, and again is a unit that's almost guaranteed to cause your opponent at least some problems. Ideally, he might want to start out of line of sight behind a big ruin, use Fly to jump over the ruin, and get somewhere towards the centre of the board on turn 1. He really does need to make his presence felt at 450 points, but he is a really big multi-threat unit. Powerful anti-tank shooting with those menhirs, a fight's last aura that can just make him almost unchargeable for some units, and can be quite nice if you are charging in alongside other Necron units, maybe some Lich Guard or Triarch Praetorians. He also allows command protocol manipulation, gives +3 command points, and I generally would want to take a big unit of Lich Guard or Triarch Praetorians near him to best use his very nice rerolls. I'd say maybe the biggest concern is him getting gunned down early to an enemy with excessive amounts of anti-tank fire. I'd say for the points his durability is okay, though not enormously standout. If he does get focused down early, you might be losing a big chunk of your army. I'd say the Mefrit Dynasty maybe looks like one of the most obvious ones to use, as it's one of the few that deals extra direct damage to the enemy, with an extra 3-inch range to weapons, and an extra pip of AP within half range. I think in general Mefrit tends to be better on any really efficient weapons that are quite low AP, and could actually really quite help things like Annihilation Barges, Night Scythes, Tesla Immortals, or Ghost Arcs with Gas Flares be a bit more usable. In general, for the most competitive lists, it seems that people prefer Novok or the custom dynasties, but it certainly could give you a very different way to play the same miniatures. Their stratagem is kind of handy as well, 1 command point for up to 3 mortal wounds from a big barrage of shooting, though on average you do need quite a lot of shots to average the max 3 mortal wounds. I think it's usually going to be worth it whenever you're rapid firing a big squad of Necron warriors. You need on average 27 shots to average the 3 mortal wounds, or 22 shots if you're hitting on 2s. It's not guaranteed though, there is always the chance of rolling low. The Nightbringers may be one of the scariest Necron threats to see on the other side of the table. He can kill near enough anything in close combat, deals out a bunch of nasty mortal wounds, and is also quite problematic to remove in himself because you can't remove any more than 3 wounds from him in one phase. Despite this though, he does cost an awful lot of points in game, 370 of them. And despite causing real problems for the opponent, the most competitive lists often choose not to bring him along. He's in a bit of a weird scenario where he's almost guaranteed to cause a fair bit of damage and problems for the opponent, but it just might not add up to 370 points worth of value by the time it's either neutralised or the game's been decided one way or the other. He does need to take out at least a couple of really big targets to really justify his inclusion. I think the Nightbringer is certainly one of the models that will need careful play, and if at all possible, ideally deleting 1 unit per turn without exposing him to multiple phases of 3 wounds worth of damage. He certainly can be a very scary unit on the board to counter certain enemy threats though. Really big characters protected by powerful invul saves are the things that he'll absolutely eat for breakfast. Crypto Thralls, despite being a little bit unassuming, are in my opinion a very solid Necron option. At only 40 points they're the cheapest infantry unit in the book, and for that investment they are fairly tough and really quite fighty in close combat for how many points you invest in them. Depending on the mission and the matchup, they could go for secondary objectives, do actions, screen or move block, or just harass the enemy. I think they're rarely going to be a bad choice in a Necron list if there's a Cryptek present. There's a whole ton of stratagems in the Necron Codex, but I think that these might be some of the higher value ones, where usually investing a command point or 2 could well be worth it. For 1 command point, Resurrection Protocols is almost an auto-use, a 4+ chance to have your injured Overlord to stand straight back up, deny your opponent the kill, and hopefully deal a bit of damage to the enemy in his own turn. Entropic Strike can make any of your Catans into a Nightbringer for 2 CP. Ignoring invul saves in close combat allows you to really counter enemy characters. Enslaved Protectors is a good one to remember for any Cryptek unit. If it makes sense to heroic intervene and disrupt the enemy, then you certainly can do so. I do quite like auto-explode stratagems, and Curse of the Pharaon can give you an auto-explode on a Necron vehicle for 1 command point. Really quite easy to decide whether or not you're using that. If there's enemy units swarming all over it, then it might well be a good idea to hand out a bunch of mortal wounds. I also really quite like Whirling Onslaught as well. That's the -1 to wound on Scarab units, either the Destroyers or the Scarab Lord. It's going to make them almost invulnerable to small arms fire or light enemy attacks, and should mean that all but the heaviest weapons are wounding them on 4s at best. Talking of Scarab Destroyers, it can often be a debate as to whether or not to bring the plasma sight along, and for me I think it's kind of take or leave. If they get into combat, it's usually going to be worth the buff, but if they don't, or if they don't get into combat with anything else that they actually need the buff against, then you might have just wasted a few points. +1 strength and +1 attack certainly does make their damage a lot nastier, and I think it'll usually outweigh the 1/6 chance to kill one of your own models, but only if the squad can be delivered into something meaningful. Against quite a lot of units they could be up to a 50% damage increase, depending on whether or not the extra strength is going to help you. I'd say maybe I'd be a little bit more tempted by the Ophidian Destroyers for it rather than the Scarpex, as they have a lower strength to begin with and do benefit a little bit more from the +1 strength part of the buff. I'd say overall the plasma side is useful, but by no means mandatory, and again kind of helpful in my opinion that you don't have to feel too bad about either taking him or leaving him. For the Forge World Necron choices in the Imperial Armor Compendium, I must admit the vast majority of units aren't particularly overwhelming. Perhaps one of my favourites is the Tesseract Arc, which is 200 points for a 10 wound vehicle with a 4+ invul save and quantum shielding. It can fly around the board relatively quickly and puts out quite a lot of nice generalist firepower. It perhaps doesn't have quite the raw firepower of the Doomsday Arc, but being able to fire at max capacity while on the move is pretty handy, so at least that damage can be applied where it needs to go. Finally, I just thought we'd mention Canoptek Spiders. Maybe not one of the top tier Necron units, but one that I find quite interesting. You can either take them as a utility unit to farm up some Scarabs, in which case I'd probably just take the one, or you could think about using them as a bit more of a damage output unit, and maybe loading them up with particle beams. At base they're a 60-point monster for 6 wounds and toughness 6, and they have a bit of melee threat. For 10 points you can get a fairly impressive 12 strength 5 shots with the particle beams, and for an extra 5 you can also upgrade to a Gloom Prism, which can put some much needed Deny the Witch into the Necron army. Ideally they want to be hanging out next to your Scarab Swarms, farming up an extra base per turn, so they can add value back onto the board both by their own threat and for the new Scarabs that they create. So I think that just about brings us to the end of our 30 quickfire tips for playing Necrons in 40k. As I mentioned before, if there's anything else that you can think of that's important, let me know down in the comments. And the same if you think I've missed anything or if you disagree with any of the points. I'm always open to hearing counter arguments. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics. I will keep regular 40k videos coming, including hopefully plenty more for the Necrons. Finally, if you have been enjoying regularly, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page, and you can find that down in the video description. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, including seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.